right, everyone. Welcome to this special live taping of Gaslit Nation's Salon. We are joined today by Dr. Lisa Corrigan, author of Prison Power: How Prison Politics Influenced the Movement for Black Liberation, and Black Feelings, Race and Effect in the Long 60s. Dr. Corrigan is the director of the Gender Studies program at the University of Arkansas, and a professor in communications and an affiliate faculty in both African and African American studies and Latin American and Latino studies. Thank you so much, Dr. Corrigan, for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So before this conversation, I have been living in 1956 Romania. My father-in-law is in the historical record in Romania for leading a student uprising in Bucharest as a 20-year-old medical student and spending 6 years in prison, which filled with other students, and they continued their efforts of resistance inside the prison camp. And I've been reading a lot of research, and so much more is coming out about his story and other stories of the nameless that were made to disappear. And I now turn to your work because what Black people, what non-white people have experienced for generations on the soil that is now called America is so similar to what Stalinist regimes, even long after Stalin was dead in the 50s and 60s, what they went through, students trying to exercise their right to meet each other, to share books, to produce artwork, to create movements for liberation. And I'm right now in America, we are obviously under this fascist threat. And people keep saying, oh, Trump is like Hitler. And I keep thinking, okay, well, let's look at that. Because, and this is just me working some things out that I need to, this is like interview/therapy session. But so with Europe, you had, of course, World War II following the Great War, which was unimaginable mass death, just like Europe littered with bodies of millions. And so, of course, you're going to look at that and say that mass trauma, that mass death, of course, it would produce a Hitler. And of course, it would produce another great war because you had just all of these broken institutions and led by broken people who were vulnerable to this happening again. In America, yes, our institutions are deeply rotted from corruption and they're gutted out in so many ways. But we haven't had the Great War on this soil in recent generations. There is this feeling of what's left of our tattered institutions can hold because people are used to a certain quality of life. And instead, the threat is really coming from this normalization of Black people filling prisons, the private prison system, non-white children being pumped into these private systems, and so on. It's really what you focus on is the ground laying of the fascism we're living with today. And that's just what I've been processing in coming to your work. And I wanted to ask you, like, how are you feeling in this moment? What are you seeing in this moment that is keeping you up at night in terms of what you've dedicated your life to?
I mean, it's really the third, Red Scare that we're living through, right? So if the first is the 1920s and the second is the 1950s, this is the third. And so it shares features. Like my PhD is in communication. And so we study these structures of communication that are recursive, right? They're circles. They ebb and they flow. They rise and they fall. They grow and they decay. And that's how democracy is in the United States. That's its history here. That's how it works, as like a series of institutions and norms. So I see this being an extremely predictable cycle. And on one hand, that's like really comforting, I think, for the historians. Like we can name these things. We can look at their features. We understand how it's going to unfold over time. We understand what order these things come in. We have a sense of their temporality. Like that's very knowable to people who think about, authoritarianism or fascism or power this way. And on the one hand, you're right, we have democratic institutions that are both, venal and also thriving in a lot of spaces, which makes the US resilient in a way that, Germany certainly wasn't. Italy certainly wasn't, right? Austria was, right? Like we have a different ecology of democracy here. That said, I think the neuroscientists would take issue with the fact that we haven't had a great destruction and trauma, and that would be COVID. I think the COVID-19 crisis has been a crisis of identity for a lot of people. Obviously, a lot of the people that live in the United States have feelings about being locked down or having to wear masks or feeling like they had to give up autonomy or doing 24/7 childcare. Like they have really, really visceral responses to the kind of responsibility that they were forced to take and the feeling that the government abandoned them. How true that is at any given moment in the last 5 years is debatable, but they have those feelings. They have that affect. I write about feelings, political feelings, and how they structure like politics itself and political reality. So for me, it's definitely clear that we have stronger democratic institutions, but the last 5 years have been really traumatic for a lot of people and have created the conditions for this kind of uneven groupthink. And that is what is feeding, I think, a lot of the emotiveness and also the policies of the administration for sure.
That's really interesting because a lot of people may have survived COVID, but not actually survived COVID. And you see it. Like I live in New York City, which is ground zero of COVID hitting
Mm-hmm.
the US. And you just see it. The recovery is still there, just a lot more mental illness on the street, people falling through the cracks. I remember just being in a taxi and a car just cutting us off viciously. And the driver said to me, he's like, that's been happening since COVID. And this was just like a
Oh
couple
yeah.
months ago. This
The
happened.
accident reports, the driving accidents have increased, and vehicular homicide and manslaughter are up. I mean, really, there are a ton of indications. I mean, we're not keeping track of them anymore because obviously we're just going to erase all the data in America. But I mean, for the people who were keeping score before 3 weeks ago, there were a tremendous number of indexes through which you can trace the way that COVID, which is not like just a respiratory illness, but also a neurological disorder and a heart disorder, and right, it is infecting all of these major systems in the body, is changing people's cognitive capacities and decreasing their threshold for uncertainty. So in communication, we study uncertainty, and across the world, Americans are the worst at dealing with uncertainty. We want to reduce uncertainty as much as possible. We do not do well in liminal spaces. We do not like indeterminacy or not knowing what's coming next.
We invented
We hate
Netflix
that.
and chill. Like that's all we want to do is just Netflix our way through the end of the world.
Yeah, I mean, people like predictability.
And so could you talk a bit about what we're seeing in terms of people being fractured individually and collectively?
I mean, the US was already on a trajectory where people were not socializing as much. They are joining groups with less frequency. They see their family less frequency. They are less educated than ever. 30 years ago, even the news was written at an eighth grade level. And now it's written at a fifth grade level. So just the ability to perceive information has changed so precipitously, on top of the cognitive changes that have come from COVID and the social changes from the massive isolation, that I think the convergence of those factors has produced a different kind of world that is also exacerbated by media, right? So social media and just doom scrolling and the amount of time people are spending online rather than in person. So that is a confluence of things that are not like one person's fault, or that was not just one moment in time. It continues to unfold. There's this theorist that we read a lot in communication named Lauren Berlant, and she talks about slow death as being like the permanent feature of American life, like whether it's, the fact that we only have for-profit healthcare and you can't get in to see your doctors, or the fact that we're going to, destroy the CDC and NIH and stop all of American scientific research, or the fact that people who have less access to higher education have lower health incomes and economic incomes, or the fact that the gig economy also was born at the moment of COVID. And so people's wages have been stagnant and they don't have adequate, in health insurance because it's tied to their job, or retirement, or any financial security. Like all of those things have happened. and they happened pretty close to the last Great Recession, right? So if this moment wipes out a bunch of savings and or gains in terms of salary, it is going to be cataclysmic. And I think that's why people are also so anxious, right? The stakes are very, very high at this moment because the precarity is spread much more widely than before. The rich-poor gap is bigger than it was even before COVID, right? There's so many more people that are one, catastrophe away from homelessness and social destruction that people are feeling very caged, and COVID exacerbated that for a lot of them.
All I want to do is hang out with you all day and ask you questions. So let me ask about, well, how did we get here? Was it just like the Reagan Revolution ushering in this culture of greed and is good, and Democrats going along for the ride, and you had this religious right extremism that accelerated the Republican Party into extremism, and the more sort of traditionalist Republicans were like, okay, well, I don't want to be a weirdo, so I'm just gonna choose, if I want to start my political career, I'm faced with these two parties, I'm going to become a Democrat because that seems more socially acceptable and cool. And so now the Democratic Party is what the Republican Party used to be, and the Republican Party is straight up Nazi. And then you had these like orphaned progressive leftists who don't, in fight, don't trust each other. Some are they all want to live in a Scandinavian country, but they don't want to support Ukraine, and they go on Russian TV because they don't understand, so there's no real solidarity with the scraps of movements that are left. And the whole world is looking at America like, get your shit together. And we're like, we can't because we hate each other. And so, what do you see as sort of the driving forces that got us into this?
Like, on the one hand, the US is just really politically immature. We're real new. We're like bad at democracy. It's like all baby steps. It's like a lot of failure. It's a little chaotic. So, if we want to talk about democracy, that's like maybe 60 years old. Like, we could benchmark it to the Civil Rights Act of 64. Anything before that is fundamentally undemocratic. FDR, great, right? There's a lot to be said about his administrations, almost four full ones, right? And also like not not a democratic moment in America, right? He was an oligarch for sure, and he consolidated power really quickly and produced 100 days of massive legislation with very little opposition in Congress. That is not the same moment that we're living in, but that moment, liberals like to tout FDR as sort of like the quintessential, Democrat, and he was not. Had he been born poor, or had he been born into a more authoritarian, time in the United States, like if he had been born a Republican, even in that moment, his outcome would have been more similar to Hitler or Franco or Mussolini, honestly. They were much more similar in sentiment and temperament, but that we were separated by two huge oceans from the great conflicts of the age. So, for me, I feel like Reagan is not entirely to blame. Like, this was set in motion. It's a Puritan nation. A bunch of this stuff is baked in to the way that we conceptualize ourselves as a nationalist project. But if I had to pinpoint one thing Reagan did, it was probably giving tax exempt status to the churches. That absolutely accelerated this moment that we're in. If I could pinpoint just one thing that's happened in the last 50 years, it's absolutely that.
I'm glad that you brought up FDR, who was seen as a class traitor among his own people for what he did. And they were scared of him because they did see him as like a Bolshevik coming through to set them on fire. It was really funny because the Met had a big exhibit on art produced by FDR's program, because he created all these jobs. He got us out of the Great Depression by pumping money, government, creating government jobs. And Biden did that. Like, the federal government became like the number one hire of new jobs. And now Trump is undoing all that, obviously, as we're seeing. But FDR, if you look at this Met exhibit of the job of these artists that were there because of his investment, it is the angriest art. It is like, we are gonna burn shit down, like eat the rich. And it's like, no wonder his own country club set, all those other trust fund kids that he grew up with, like, hated him, like went to their newspapers that they owned and tried to destroy him with their press. It's so interesting.
I mean, he had better politics, but he was a megalomaniac. He was totally, worked alone. He basically negotiated Yalta solo. Like he had two kids roll with him up to Yalta to like negotiate the end of the war. Like, he had a lot of dispositional similarities, but he took a different turn than the rest of his contemporaries facing similar circumstances after the Great Depression. So there's a lesson to be learned there, but it's not like the end of the war produced this amazing outcome other than the financial consequences of the Marshall Plan, right? We had massive Jim Crow expansion and then backlash. So in some ways, I feel like this moment is a backlash. Obviously, I write about this to the 60s and to social equality, right? So the best things about FDR were his commitments to social equality insofar as they had an economic background. But we are in a moment where we're disincentivizing equality and massively incentivizing inequality. And I think that for me, what keeps me awake at night is that. Like the social, and we are becoming an apartheid state by intentional erosion of governmental norms. And in some ways, I think that's going to be a rude wake up call for progressives because they're going to find themselves saying centrist things about public goods and about the importance of the state. And that's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of them. It puts them over the barrel in a lot of ways, especially in terms of their purity tests about what it looks like to be a progressive.
Oh, they don't know how to be a progressive. They're just trying to impress people on social media. It's very like fashionable centric. It's really shallow. And I'm glad you said about how politically immature America is. My husband is from Paris, and I he says all the time, he's like, "You America's a teenager. We're like this hormonal teenager." And I've shown
This
him,
is a tantrum. This is a tantrum. The
yeah,
tariffs are a tantrum. The threats to annex are a tantrum. Hitler was also very tantrumy. They have a bunch of man feelings about it, what it looks like to like show their enemies who's boss. I mean, it's all extremely baby behavior.
yeah, but and it's not exclusive to Trump. Trump is a product of the United States, and so is the incredibly weak, pathetic opposition to Trump. I remember back in 2016, I was one of a handful of people saying Trump is in bed with Russia. It's obvious because his campaign manager Paul Manafort is a longtime Kremlin operative in my native Ukraine where my family escaped. And so, like, if that Kremlin operative who fucked up Ukraine is running Trump's campaign for free, that means the Kremlin is running Trump's campaign. And I got hit pieces by, the Atlantic and New Republic, very respectable media in the US. And I showed it to my husband. My husband's like, this is shallow as fuck. You're mad about this? And he's right. He's absolutely right. And I remember telling my dad was reading like New York Review of Books or something at the time, and I was like, Dad, I got a hit piece in the Atlantic. He's like, the Atlantic is shit. If it was a New York Review of Books, then you'd have a problem. But yeah, so and so it just goes. So this is where we are, America, and I feel like you and I are like broadcasting to like aliens in the future or historians in the future. Like this is how we got here. And so when would you say democracy began in the United States? What year?
I would say 64 with the Civil Rights Act. I mean, I think that's why the Supreme Court has been so hell-bent on like reversing voting rights, right? Like to roll back the gains of the 1960s, no matter how incomplete they were, has been the project of the right in the United States since Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, which also came out in 64. So that's like their mega project. It's not like Project 2025 just started. It started with Conscience of a Conservative, which became the blueprint for all of the ideas in the GOP about that changed their ideas, right? The GOP used to support abortion rights. Like Barry Goldwater got a 16-year-old daughter an abortion. Richard Nixon supported abortion. Eisenhower supported abortion. Gerald and Betty Ford supported abortion. Like once that became the litmus test during the Reagan administration for the 1980 election, and Reagan was able to buy the votes by the Catholics and the evangelicals, that changed the negotiating leverage that the GOP had within the country because they brought all of this cash money from the evangelicals and Catholics to campaigning. But it didn't start there. Like just the backlash cycle started there, right? I mean, you could argue that it started with Brown versus Board 10 years earlier, but the liberal wins, right, really, really get codified in the Supreme Court in 64. So I think the US is really only 60 years old as a serious, well, semi-serious democracy, but we are not a serious democracy. We are not a serious people. We're a barely literate people, and we hate our neighbors and we hate ourselves, and it makes us exhausting to the rest of the world. My students ask me all the time, what do people outside of the United States think about us? And I'm like, they think that you are indulgent. They think that you are decadent and barely literate. And if you had access to international news in your cable package, you would be able to see what all of the large countries around the world have to say about you, right? So they, I think, find it very surprising that they don't have access to other people's opinions. But if you grow up in France, you hear everybody's opinions about France, and people in France have a lot of feelings and ideas about their own history and government that they share widely and frequently, and they practice thinking together, but they're also a lot smaller. And, a lot of the things that you were saying in terms of the fantasies that progressives have about the Nordic countries, I mean, those people have a lot of the, advantages that they have right now because they've been subsidized by a world order that's had two hegemons and a immigration policy that's really, really racist. So they exclude people on the front end from coming to their country so that they can justify doing social democracy by giving it mostly to white people, right? Like Iceland is great, and they do not allow any immigration of any kind. So they're super, super isolationist in terms of immigration. That's not negligible. That's like constitutive of who they are. So one of the problems with having a polyglot society that's full of all these different kinds of people from all these different kinds of places in this giant landmass that's mostly rural is that we are not thinking together at all.
Do you see any efforts to overcome that? I mean, the loneliness epidemic has been here for a while. It's been growing over the last 20 years or so. Social media is still relatively new. It came on the scene in a big way, toppling dictators in the Arab Spring, and now it's toppling democracy because the dictators like, oh, we can figure this out for ourselves and use it against you now. And they are. And so we're still in the infancy of that. What way do you see, like when you go on your nature walks, let's say, I'm assuming you you do given what you study, where does your mind go in terms of a path forward for us here in the United States specifically?
I would say that the biggest threat is actually the confluence of AI and fascism. So I did a big thread, I don't know, in the spring last year, and I was like, the story is not Democrats in disarray. It's AI crypto taking over the entire political economy. And I did a long interview with a big, financial trade press, and they were like, what are you even talking about? And I was like, the democracy just got bought. We are now a company store for Musk et al. So like, are you into that? Because that's what is on the doorstep. And so thinking about the way that this is not artificial intelligence, what they're like, ChatGPT is not artificial intelligence. At best, it's like some data scraping and language acquisition stuff. But that is something that I think about a lot, is what does it look like to wholly reject technologizing all of human encounters, especially the communicative ones. Like people are going to have an opinion about that. That's not just like, I don't know, I don't like talking to the chat bot when I have to return stuff to a store, right? Like that is so not where the conversation needs to be. I just don't know that we have the vocabulary for it. And I don't know what comes after you de-develop the largest industrial democracy on earth, right? Like we're going to have to rebuild institutions. Ideally, that would be better. It's not going to happen very soon, but we're going to have to figure out education. In the state, I live in Arkansas, right? And so our state budget is 40% education, higher and K through 12, 40% prisons, and 20% everything else that runs the state. And that's most of the states that are my size in America, which are mostly rural. That's prisons and schools. That's where the most of the money is going in the United States. So if we cannot figure out the relationship between prisons and schools and what the public good means for the good life, all of this is going to be for naught. So that's what I think about on my nature walks, is like how to reject AI from further destroying communication strategies and education, and how to unfund, right, this mass criminalization and produce better people who think together more gently.
Thank you for that. You are the second guest. Last week's episode was with Gil Duran of Nerdreich, and he was saying if you want to know who the controlled opposition is in the Democratic Party, Look at who's taking money from crypto.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to destabilize the US dollar and then force us all to buy their proprietary, coins. And nobody's going to have access to that. And the country has no financial literacy about the dollar. So they're not going to like skill up, right, to understand fake money. And so I mean it's going to be a massive crisis, and that's just assuming that the FDIC holds and you can get into your bank and they're not going to raid Social Security or your 401ks, and I don't know why we would assume that. So, I think for me, if we're thinking about how susceptible people are to groupthink about fascism and how technology and isolation exploit their fear of uncertainty, you are looking at like the perfect storm for what is going to be the development of the entire country. And I think probably the West, given how many other countries rely on the dollar and trading with us to stabilize their own economies. So the hostility that we're seeing from other foreign governments is, I think, well founded.
Oh, without question. The recent news story, I think it came out today, that the Trump regime took tens of millions of dollars of federal funding, literally took it out of the Bank of New York. That is extremely destabilizing for the US dollar, because what it tells the world is that the White House will just go into your bank and take your money. And what that was meant to do was not just Trump being crazy and doing, crossing these boundaries that should not be crossed, and norm breaking. It's not that. What he's doing is pushing and forcing this idea of crypto, because the entire allure, the entire selling point of crypto is that you no longer need banks. Your entire fortune is going to exist on your hard drive. So wherever you exist in the world, that hard drive or whatever, that solid piece of hardware can contain your entire fortune, and no bank can take it from you. And so they have to possess you body and soul in order, and you can like put your fortune in a lockbox somewhere and not tell them how to get access to it, so your fortune will be safe that way, like a pirate hiding your treasure somewhere. And so Trump now breaking one of like the worst things you can do, just reaching inside a bank and taking out money, that is going to accelerate the movement for crypto. That was all intentional to weaken the dollar.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. I think that they will come for the FDIC. There will be like insurance is like not real anyway, right? It's not like anybody's really paying out to insure your money. That's like, good faith at best. And people are going to lose everything that they have, and it's going to be devastating. It's really hard for me not to see this as a pre-apocalyptic moment, right? This is like what it looks like before the collapse. And this is what it feels like before the collapse. And the people who get that, oddly enough, are sort of the preppers and the people who are like, property good, right? Like the only thing left is property, and it's only tenuous at best, because they understand that the thing that comes next is not going to be availability. I mean, I'm, in Arkansas, and so Walmart put out their first quarter report, Dollar General put out their first quarter report, and the reports are like, we are expecting less revenue because our customers are no longer coming into the store, dot, 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 because they're being deported, right? So like the entire structure of labor is being undone. The mass unemployment that's here, like DC, I lived in DC for 10 years, like it's a disaster. Everybody's underwater in their mortgages. They're not going to be able to sell their properties. They're going to get snapped up when they go into foreclosure. It's going to be just like Enron, and it's going to be just like Countrywide. And we're going to have a massive depression. We're just on the doorstep of it. This is just the bubble. And they're going to try and bring as many politicians over the crossing as they can so that it looks like there's still a functioning democracy, even though there isn't.
So this is a repeat of the Great Depression. So obviously this feels very apocalyptic, but so did life back then too. So you're saying that even though this time seems out of the norm, it very much is native to America's history, especially recent history.
Yeah, I mean, especially with defunding like all of our science initiatives, there's no reason to think that a dust bowl won't come, right? We're going to have a massive environmental catastrophe, and we've already defunded FEMA. So we just had a bunch of tornadoes come through my state. It's unclear how much aid is going to get there from the federal government, or if the states are just going to be forced to like manage their own catastrophes, and if that's going to be an act of retribution from a Republican federal executive branch, right? Who's like, oh, are you a blue state? Good luck, fuck off, right? It's very possible that they might just say that. So the amount of like cost that can rack up from even just environmental devastation like the Great Depression is substantial, right? Or like the Dust Bowl in combination with the failure of the banks, we're looking at that as a very likely, scenario, whether it's bird flu or something else. I mean, there are no guardrails left on public health, so there's no reason to think that fracking out the money in US banks combined with the public health crisis wouldn't produce the same outcome. It's just going to be magnified because there's so many more people.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of where we are. It's just this weird fever dream right now of normalization, hypernormalization that we're all sort of in, waiting for it all to, but there's not going to be one event. Like there'll be moments just like the orange cloud of toxic smoke descended
Totally.
on New York City and everything. There's going to be moments like that'll be disruptive, but mostly people are going to go about their lives. And I think that's the most surprising thing about living in a fascist system is how much of your life does go on and birthday parties go on and all that stuff.
I mean, I guess so, except like the minimum wage hasn't gone up in 25 years. So the stability is actually in the massive rich poor gap, which hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 30 years. So, it is a slow death situation where all these people have been just barely on the brink of collapse for so long. All they're doing is trying to keep one foot out of the grave. And, that's all that there is really. It's not like there are all these people who have social mobility or class mobility or access to all of these ways to really transform their lives. That has not existed for like really ever, but certainly even as like something that we talk about. So I don't see a moment where we all get on the same page and like, show up. And also America's rural. So, there are these huge vast swaths of the United States where things are happening in small towns where like 15 people show up at their county courthouse. And that's important, but it doesn't get the same traction as seeing like 250,000 people downtown in a national capital doing X, Y, or Z or protest. This is not South Korea, right? This is not, where you're going to have one image event that totally changes the course of the nation's history. We're not at that point because everybody is so fragmented. And I don't know that we will get there. I think the Tesla, right, protests are probably the closest in this moment that we're seeing to a coordinated pushback, but I don't know what it looks like yet beyond that.
I wanted to ask you about resistance strategies to this. Obviously, self-reliance is going to be key. And your book, Prison Power, of these organizers, some famous, some many not, but that they all made meaningful contributions. And could you speak a little bit about that? Because I do feel that in authoritarian history, it's like these stories of building progress were led by non-white people, namely Black people, namely Black women. And just the other day, I was in Greenwood Cemetery, where there's a giant, so many famous graves to Black women that like funded John Brown's raid, and like other stories like that. So could you talk about prison power, how prison, that whole sort of culture in the inside and out, like how it helped shape their strategies and shape them as people?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up John Brown. I write about him too, and I've been thinking a lot about abolitionism and direct abolition, radical abolitionists, the ones who believe that it was okay to take up arms to end slavery, of which John Brown is certainly the most famous. And I think one of the things that distinguished John Brown from all of the other abolitionists of his age is not just that he was willing to take up arms, right, to end slavery, or the fact that he believed in equality among the races, which he did, and that was something that was distinguishable between him and certainly his white contemporaries, but it's the fact that he was willing to sacrifice for it. And, especially white America, our risk threshold is very low. Our tolerance for risk is very low. And I sort of joke about it because as a white girl who was like born in the 70s, the most radical shit I saw white girls doing on TV was like dancing because their dad was like a Vietnam vet, right? And so maybe they played chicken on a tractor. Like, I don't, Footloose is not like, the protest, like, pièce de la resistance. And yet that's like the most resistance I've seen white chicks do in movies ever, like in my youth. So it's not like white people have all of these models really. And That said, there are white people at the vanguard of most of the major movements in the history of the United States, including, right, abolition, of which John Brown is sort of the key figure. But, the thing that John Brown, the things he learned were from Harriet Tubman, right? And from the Black men and women that he lived among in upstate New York, and, the people that he stole and, repatriated out of slavery and into freedom. So I think that one thing that has to be understood is that this is not going to be a moment where people cannot take risks. If you want to see a different outcome, you are going to have to take risks that endanger yourself, your livelihood, your personhood, your sense of ability. And that is obviously distributed differently based on your bodies, right? How much risk you can absorb is different based on race, class, sex, gender, geography, ability, whatever. All of those things are true. And yet, a popular front, it takes a lot of people, and most of the risk is shouldered by the most vanguard, and those are mostly Black, brown people, disabled people. And so there are a lot of lessons to be learned from struggles where this has already been, right, thought through, worked through, strategized through. So I think one thing that's very heartening to me is that people are reading anti-fascist literature now, right? There's so much time to prepare for a second Trump administration, that people have had some time to sit with Timothy Snyder and read about, right, fascism in Ceausescu's, right, Romania, and think through like all of these things. So there is more space now, and people have had a bit more time to sort of adjust to the idea. But the uptake, it's happening so fast. I think most people really didn't have a sense that it would just go so quickly. I think that's really where the whiplash is.
Yeah, it's resilience targeting, where they're trying to overwhelm us. Who are some women that are your historical mentors, like some of the queens throughout American history that keep you going, that keep you sort of grounded in fighting the good fight of getting historical truth out there into the world?
The women. I mean, Harriet Tubman, without a doubt. I mean, there's a reason that John Brown called her the General, right? Is because she was the brains behind radical abolitionism. And I think without a doubt has the best win record, if we're keeping score, like of people who did massively risky things coming back into the United States over and over and over again to, escape people to freedom. So I would say her. And I write about radical Black traditions. So I think about Robert F. Williams and the Black Panthers a lot, and think about their nascent views about property rights and mutual aid and their survival programs. And I think the survival programs, as particularly the Black Panther Party, are really useful because so many women were doing leadership roles in the Black Panthers, and they were the most egalitarian organization in the United States in the 60s. And men were doing childcare, and they were doing grocery runs, and they were doing after school education. And it was, I think, an egalitarian spirit of community mutual aid that is essential right now. Like, who is your community? What do you have that you can lend? What skills can you map? And honestly, it's not sexy to make spreadsheets, but it's like freedom is one long meeting, and you need to have spreadsheet skills. So like for me, I was driving around during the election, and I pointed out to my 14-year-old, like, I'm like, let's see where people have signs in their yards, because in 1968, people did not put up, like, white people did not put Black Panther signs in their yards and identify as being pro-science and pro-immigrant and, right, anti-racist. So I'm like, these are the people who are willing to identify themselves publicly as committed to a politic. Knowing your neighborhood map of who's willing to just take that risk to put a sign up in their yard, that's good organizing, right? I would take them cookies, right? What do you have that you can share? HHS sent out a note that they had all these free COVID tests that they needed to get rid of, right? Because the expiration dates are coming up. So I ordered 6,000, and I took them to all my neighbors that had signs out. And I was like, yo, I've got all these COVID tests. They're free. I did not pay for them. Would you like some? Feel free to say no, right? So I was able to come across a resource that I didn't have to pay for. And I've been giving out to people who are public facing to be like, yo, I'm Lisa. I live next door. I live down the street. My kid trick or treats here. Would you like these? And that's two-way organizing, because you're meeting a need that they haven't expressed already, but it's an act of generosity. Anything that you can do that's generous and that you don't expect anything from in return is good organizing. And so we have lots of models in American history, but the thing about social movements is that they fail because the state is bigger. So you also have to be resilient enough to manage the setbacks when you do ultimately meet resistance. And that's a tough pill to swallow for people, especially when they don't have a living wage.
We are recording the history that we're living through now. As someone who depends on primary sources, memoirs, what advice do you have for us in taking note of what we're living through and leaving behind a honest, emotionally honest historical record?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, they've all been great questions, but that's a sexy question. And I'll tell you why. You have got to see yourselves as archivists because so much information is being erased intentionally. So I bought everybody I knew like Polaroid cameras, and I was like, take pictures because they will last longer. Like somebody comes for your phone, you're not going to get those pictures. Somebody sees your hard drive, you're not going to get those pictures. Take actual pictures. So written records, printouts, like hard copies, analog things will survive more than your digital. None of your digital stuff is going to last. You're never going to see that stuff ever again. It's going to degrade. It's going to get lost. It's going to get damaged. It's not serious. I would also say I talk with a lot of people who are newly electeds, and I'm like, I need you to keep an archive. That means like print out the things and put them upside down in order so that when you give them to a library, right, they are in order of how you produce them, right? Save somebody some time later. But you also have to think about where you can donate things. And that means to preserve libraries and heritage sites and places where, people are doing the curatorial work of managing our memory because that's also being destroyed. The attacks on libraries are not just an attack on free speech, but they're an attack on memory. And if we're already not readers, right, it's really a hard time because then all of this stuff is going to get memory hold and people be like, I don't remember what the early days were like in the pandemic in New York when body bags were everywhere and there was nowhere to refrigerate people because the overwhelm was so huge. We cannot memory hold that. It's not responsible to do that. That means we all have to be archivists, right? In whatever way we can, but analog is better than digital.